Welcome to Heart of the West, where every mark tells a tale. Words ain't my strong suit, sir, but cooking surely is. The weathered rancher studied her closely before declaring, "Consider yourself employed, and consider this your sanctuary." It was New Mexico territory in the dying days of summer, 1879. The blazing sun began its descent beyond the parched, dirt-laden peaks, stretching dark silhouettes across the endless prairie. Gusts of wind caught the crimson earth along the pathway, spinning it into tiny whirlwinds that pirouette over wheel tracks and brittle vegetation. Though the scorching heat had finally relented, the atmosphere still wrapped around you like threadbare clothing. Owen Booker planted himself firmly on his ranch house veranda, feet solidly positioned, muscles tense, observing as the breeze gradually stilled. He'd been repairing the barn's metal fasteners when he detected it a gentle rap, barely audible yet unmistakably deliberate. He pivoted. There at his porch's boundary stood a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, appearing ready to crumble where she stood. Thin as a post, her footwear nearly falling apart, wrapped in a tattered wrap whose torn edges fluttered like cobwebs in the evening air. Between her fingers, she cradled an iron cooking vessel as though it contained precious treasure. No grin crossed her face. No pleading escaped her lips. Though her voice wavered, her gaze remained unwavering. "Words ain't my strong suit, sir, but cooking surely is." Owen remained silent, examining her carefully. He noticed her cracked lips, the way her legs shook yet refused to give way, how her scarred hands maintained their grip on that pot as if it held the final remnant of her mother's memory. His forehead creased. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she replied, gentle as a whispered prayer. He peered past her along the dusty trail. No cart, no beast of burden, nothing except dust particles and the setting sun. "You got people somewhere?" She shook her head once. He observed her empty fingers wrapped around the pot's handle. The edges bore soot marks baked deep, suggesting more campfire meals than kitchen preparation. For an extended moment, only silence and the groaning of weathered wood filled the space between them. Then he moved aside. "Consider yourself employed," he stated, adding with a quietness that resembled surrender, "and consider this your sanctuary." Ellie's shoulders sagged not from exhaustion, but like someone finally setting down a burden carried far too long. She moved forward, her boots making barely a whisper against the wooden planks. He didn't extend his hand or inquire further. She passed by him, eyes taking in the porch, the entrance, every corner. She entered the dwelling like someone stepping carefully into a half-remembered dream. The interior was tidy yet lifeless. Minimal furnishings, no blooms brightening the space. A kettle sat corroding on the rear burner. The fireplace was swept clean but clearly unused. She hesitated in the entryway, turning slightly. "Where might I rest?" Owen gestured toward the rear chamber. "There's a small bed, fresh linens, water basins filled. We'll discuss duties tomorrow. Tonight, you'll have a proper meal." She nodded once and vanished down the corridor. Owen lingered alone as the sun sank to half its size. He gazed across. His property, barren fields, a pair of cattle, a chicken shelter half collapsed, and the kind of silence that had persisted through too many harsh seasons. Then he stepped inside, closed the door, and for the first time in ages, left it unlocked. Fresh bread's aroma was always Ellie's earliest childhood memory. Rich, dense, and drifting through gaps in the wooden floor. Her father, George May, labored over Millstone Bakery's ovens before daybreak, his hands perpetually coated in flour and bearing burn marks. Her mother, Lillian, stitched garments and hummed melodies in a tongue Ellie never identified. They possessed little, but they had each other until winter of '74, when her mother's cough produced blood and the physician declared nothing could help. Ellie was 14 when she witnessed her father pressing damp cloths against a forehead that no longer responded. She laid her mother to rest in a pauper's plot with a wooden marker carved from her father's bread paddle. The mine accident came 2 years afterward. George had accepted additional work extracting coal to settle debts from Lillian's treatments. They never recovered his body completely. At T16, Ellie found herself completely alone. She attempted to maintain the bakery's operation. She understood mixing, kneading, judging bread's readiness by scent alone, but women couldn't conduct business in those regions without male sponsorship. The property owner, Cyrus Elwood, permitted her to remain briefly, then began securing the rear entrance and lingering inappropriately when she worked near the hearth. She departed one evening with bruises hidden beneath her collar and the iron pot her mother had used for berry preserves. It was her sole possession. She traveled eastward initially toward Hayden's Fork, hoping the church might offer assistance. However, the minister's spouse clutched her Bible when Ellie approached, and a youth at the mercantile hollered, "No husband's trailing that one." She begged without words, simply held out the pot. At the following settlement, she proposed cooking in exchange for lodging. The innkeeper allowed her to clean dishes. On the third evening, he entered her room without knocking. She broke his nose with a ladle and fled before dawn. 3 settlements, for days. Ice in her sleeves, sores on her feet. She sheltered in lofts beneath wagons. Once behind a metalsmith's forge, where an intoxicated man hurled his bottle at her for snoring too loudly. When she finally spotted the wooden entrance of a ranch at civilization's edge, her lips were split and her stomach had forgotten warm nourishment. She stood beyond the barrier, one hand gripping the iron pot, the other drawing her wrap tight across her ribs. "I don't want your sympathy," she murmured to the empty air. "Just your flame." Then everything spun sideways. She couldn't recall falling. Only dirt against her face, the sound of hooves, a voice harsh and distant, "Someone fetch water." When consciousness returned, it wasn't to sunrise. The silence felt different, warmer. She smelled oats bubbling on a stove, stone walls surrounding her, a blanket carrying cedar scent, and a man with weathered hands placing her pot near the hearth as if it were made of crystal. He hadn't taken it. That's how Ellie Mae understood she hadn't been robbed, merely rescued, yet she kept one hand on that handle throughout the night, just to be certain. The door groaned as Owen pushed it open, revealing a chamber shrouded in shadows and neglect. "You'll stay here," he said simply, indicating the bed without meeting her eyes. His voice remained steady, but his lingering at the doorway suggested the room held deeper significance than his brief words conveyed. Ellie stepped inside, bare feet touching the cool floorboards polished smooth by years of gentle footsteps. The air carried the faintest hint of lavender, long vanished but persistent in its presence. The bed stood precisely made in the corner, a hand-sewn coverlet pulled tight across it, edges untouched by recent use. A lace doily rested atop the nightstand, yellowed with age. A shelf held a wooden hairbrush, a fractured mirror, and embroidered gloves, rigid with time and memory. "This belonged to her," Ellie asked softly, not intruding, simply confirming what the room already revealed. How a space can whisper loss without utterance. Owen gave the slightest acknowledgement, his gaze fixed on the doorframe. "My wife, Clara. Fever claimed her, spring of '74. Ellie lowered her eyes, her voice barely audible. "I'll maintain it properly. You have my word." He remained another breath, longer, then turned without speaking and left her alone in the chamber where spirits still dwelled. She stood in the quiet for an extended time, running her hand gently along the dresser's surface, careful not to disturb anything. Dust gathered on her fingertips. She approached the window, its glass streaked with time, and drew the curtain back just enough to allow a silver of moonlight inside. Then carefully she folded her blanket on the chair and sat at the bed's edge, uncertain if she belonged, but grateful to be indoors. The following morning, Ellie opened the door to discover a bundle of kindling and 2 fresh eggs resting on the bench outside. No message, no knock, simply there, like a silent gift from someone who didn't know how to express welcome. She brought them inside and entered the kitchen, then paused. It felt colder than anticipated. The hearth had long grown cold. Spiderwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The stove wore a layer of fine gray ash as though the last flame had died quietly one night, and no one possessed the will to revive it. Pans rusted where hooks once displayed them proudly, their handles drooping like weary limbs. She moved through slowly, fingers trailing along the surfaces. Knife marks scarred the wood where onions and apples had once been prepared. A container of dried herbs, unopened, sat on a dusty shelf. She lifted it and turned it in her palm. Someone had cherished this place, then abandoned it. She rolled up her sleeves and secured her hair, found a cloth, heated water, scrubbed the surfaces until the wood grain showed again. She opened every window, letting in the pale morning light. The breeze was sharp, but it smelled fresh. It felt like resurrecting a memory. She discovered a chipped blue bowl tucked in a cupboard's rear, washed it twice, then cracked the eggs into it. Her hands trembled, but the rhythm of whisking calmed her. She added salt from a nearly full jar, chopped onions finely, and moved like someone who had always known how to work with fire and hunger. As the scent of eggs and heat began filling the air, she reached up and rehung a sun-faded curtain. A triangle of golden light spilled across the old wooden floor, catching something tucked between 2 books. She leaned closer, a photograph worn and soft at the edges, barely clinging to its frame. a woman with gentle eyes and a boy smiling shyly beside her. Owen's wife, his son. Ellie stared at it for a long while, then bowed her head. "I'll care for it properly," she whispered. She wasn't certain if she meant the photograph, the house, or the silence that still clung to its bones. Perhaps all three. Later that day, the floor creaked softly as Owen stepped into the kitchen, his shadow reaching toward the hearth. He paused, inhaling the air not intrusively, just curiously. "You used the thyme," he said, more observation then question. Ellie, wiping flour from her apron, looked up. It was still fresh. He nodded once. "Clara favored thyme in her eggs." She met his gaze. "Then I'll continue using it." Owen departed without another word, his boots echoing softly on the porch. That evening, Ellie noticed the kindling by the stove was stacked higher, more thoughtfully arranged, and she stirred the stew longer, letting the warmth settle deep into the walls and perhaps into him. The snow had gentled outside, the wind dying into a hush that allowed the ranch to breathe again. Inside, the air warmed not just with fire, but with something unfamiliar, a scent that hadn't visited these walls in years. It was the fragrance of home, chicken bones simmering gently, rosemary weaving its subtle promise through the rising steam, and the faint sweetness of fresh cornbread cooling by the hearth. Ellie stood by the stove, careful not to spill a drop, ladling chicken soup into a deep ceramic bowl that once belonged to Owen's wife. The broth shimmered golden in the lantern light, filled with tender carrot rounds, cubed potatoes, and a whisper of rosemary not from any recipe book, but embedded in her memory. It was a formula passed down by her mother, learned by heart. Around crackling stoves and shared through lullabies that soothed a child to sleep. Beside the bowl, she placed a slice of cornbread, its edges brown just enough to break with a soft crunch. She ran her fingers over the crust, remembering how her mother used to gently pat down the batter before baking, humming melodies that felt like sunlight itself. She carried the plate to the table and stepped back. Owen was already seated, his rough hands folded in his lap, eyes unreadable in the dim kitchen light. He watched the food with quiet intensity, as though tasting something far beyond flavor. Ellie offered a quiet nod, voice soft like the falling snow. "It's nothing elaborate, just farm cooking." He didn't reply. Instead, he reached for the spoon and dipped it into the soup. The room fell into a silence thicker than the steam. All she heard was the slow scrape of metal against ceramic, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, and the subtle crackle of the hearth fire. Each moment stretched longer than the one before. She stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, waiting not for praise, but for permission to believe that this was enough. Owen finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down with deliberate care. He drew a breath as if tasting the words before letting them out. "Cornbread's the kind that holds together," he said, voice low and measured. Ellie's shoulders eased as she nodded. "Cornmeal and lard. No eggs, Mama's trick when the hens wouldn't lay." He listened, eyes on the bowl before shifting toward her. "Good soup." Her heart lifted, but her voice remained small. "Thank you." He rose then, placing his spoon back in the bowl, and stepped outside into the cold. The screen door closed softly behind him. Ellie exhaled, shoulders slumping as the tension left her body. She turned back toward the sink, carrying the bowl with her, still braced as though waiting for the moment he would change his mind. But she felt something settle instead, something like hope. Later that night, she made her way through the kitchen, a candle in hand and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. On impulse, she paused at the threshold, sensing rather than seeing. Owen stood by the window, barely moving. His figure was outlined against the dark glass, the faint reflection of the hearth fire behind him. His arms were folded across his chest, silent and steady. From where she stood, she could feel the weight of his gaze not on the night sky, but on the kitchen itself. The pot still sat on the stove, its glow spilling into the darkness. The aroma of thyme lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. He didn't see her standing there, but Ellie saw everything. The way his jaw was set, the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little. This wasn't a man distrustful of her cooking or her hands. He was a man who hadn't let anything close in many years. A man who had built walls of silence, brick by careful brick, to shield himself from the world's betrayals. And now she realized he feared that to enjoy something simple, a hot bowl of soup, a warm slice of cornbread, a quiet kitchen filled with ordinary life, was to risk remembering what he had lost. She swallowed, eyes fixed on his reflection. She whispered into the gloom, words barely louder than a breath. "You can trust the small things, Owen. Just the small things." Behind her, the fire didn't die. It crackled gently, a promise that some warmth could return and that some losses could be healed, one quiet meal at a time. The night sky stretched wide over the plains, stars piercing the velvet darkness like someone had stitched light into the heavens. The wind was gentle for once, curling around the porch like an old dog resting at their feet. Ellie sat on the top step, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, knees pulled up to her chest. Owen sat beside her, boots planted firm on the ground, hat tipped low to keep the chill off his ears. They had eaten supper in silence: roasted turnips, leftover stew, and slices of cornbread from the morning batch. Now they sat together, not talking, not needing to. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was full, the kind of silence that held space like a blanket between them. After a while, Ellie broke it, her voice gentle. "My mama once burned a whole tray of biscuits," she said. "Left them in too long while telling me a story about how Papa asked her to marry him." Owen tilted his head, eyes still on the sky. "We didn't have much that day. She was so mad at herself, crying and cursing up a storm. But my papa just took one, said, 'Burned love is still love if it's warm,' and ate the whole thing." A quiet laugh escaped her lips. "I laughed so hard I nearly choked. Then Mama started laughing too. She always did get mad at herself more than anyone else." Owen's lips quirked at the corners. Then, barely, he chuckled, a soft, short sound, but real. It was the first time Ellie had heard him laugh. She turned slightly, stealing a glance. In the starlight, his face looked gentler than usual, the shadows kinder. She didn't say anything more, just let it sit there between them. When the night deepened and they stood to go inside, Owen paused by the door. "I'll fix the dining table tomorrow," he said. Ellie blinked. "Why?" He shrugged once, voice low. "You need space to roll dough. That old sideboard's too narrow." Ellie nodded, heart catching a little. "Thank you," she said. The next morning, before sunrise, she found him in the dining room, sleeves rolled up, sanding the edge of the long oak table. The surface had warped over the years, bent from heat and spills and time. He worked quietly, methodically, smoothing the wood with patient care. She stood in the doorway watching. "You don't need to," she said. He kept sanding. "You don't ask for much. Just seems right." That afternoon she baked again. This time it was sweet rolls, light, golden, brushed with honey. When she brought him one, he took it in his calloused hand and bit in without a word. But when he looked at her just a moment, just a glance, she saw something had shifted. Not much, but something. A week later, she found a new rolling pin on the shelf. Not new, really, just newly carved from oak, shaped by hand. It fit her grip perfectly. There was no note, no mention of it, but she knew, and she whispered into the flour that morning, "Some men love louder without words," and the dough rose just fine. The day had been long and dry. Ellie spent the morning kneading bread and the afternoon hanging wet linens across the fence. The wind tugged them like restless hands, and she could feel a storm building, though the sky stayed blue. By sundown, she was in the kitchen dusting flour from her apron when the knock came. Not on the front door, on the side gate. 3 slow raps against the wooden post. Then silence. Owen was still out in the pasture checking the irrigation ditch. Ellie stepped out onto the porch cautiously, a rag in hand, her heart thudding like it always did when the world felt too quiet. A man stood at the gate, tall, lean, with a crooked smile that held no kindness. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Ain't this a surprise?" Ellie froze. His name was Silas. He had lived 2 rooms down from her in the boarding house back in Junction Hollow, one of the places she had fled through on her way west. He had never touched her, but he had looked, spoken to sweetly, smelled like sweat and sour whiskey. He had offered her things she never asked for, then turned cruel when she refused. "I was just passing through," he said, stepping closer. "Saw the smoke from the chimney. Thought maybe someone here had a plate to spare. Didn't think I'd find you of all people." Ellie gripped the rag tighter. "Thought you were gone for good," he said, eyes scanning the yard, the porch, the table behind her. "But look at this. Fresh laundry, porch flowers, and a clean dress. You must be doing all right for yourself." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "You still cooking? I remember that stew you made for the old widow on the 2nd floor. Smelled like Sunday supper." Silas leaned in slightly, his tone dropping lower. "Funny you never said goodbye when you left. Thought we were friends." Ellie took a step back, and then boot steps. Firm, purposeful. Owen, he had returned from the pasture silently, like the land itself had warned him. His shirt was damp with sweat, one glove half pulled off, his eyes locked on Silas. He didn't speak for a moment, just moved to stand beside Ellie. Then he did something she would never forget. Without a word, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. A small gesture, but it said everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "She works here. She belongs here." Silas blinked. The charm on his face flickered, then vanished. "Well, I didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered, backing up a step. "Just passing through." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, Miss Ellie." Then he turned and walked off into the dust. Ellie stood still, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. Owen said nothing more. He didn't tighten his grip, didn't look down at her, just kept his hand there for a few seconds longer, then let go and stepped back, giving her space. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. "You don't owe me thanks," he replied. A good cook deserves a safe kitchen, but his eyes said more than that. Later that night, after supper, Ellie stood by the window and watched the horizon, wondering if Silas had really gone, if he had said anything to anyone, if he would come back. Owen was in the workshop sharpening tools, but when she walked into the kitchen the next morning, she found a fresh horseshoe hanging above the back door, a quiet ward, a signal of protection, and she knew without needing to ask that Owen had put it there. She touched the curve of the iron, then went to stoke the fire. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her without demand, without condition, just because she was there, just because she mattered. And that made all the difference. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, painting the wooden floor in ribbons of gold. Ellie stood barefoot by the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her fingers dusted with flour. The dough was ready, soft, rich with buttermilk and butter, and the old tin cutter waited by her side. Behind her, Owen lingered near the door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You said you never learned to bake," she said without turning around. "I didn't," he admitted. "Was always more skilled at burning things than browning them." She smiled and patted the dough. "Then today we fixed that." He hesitated, then stepped forward, awkwardly pulling up a chair beside her at the long table. Ellie guided him through each step, her voice calm and patient. "Cut, press, fold. Don't overwork it. Butter needs to stay cold." Owen listened closely, trying to follow her every motion, but his large hands were clumsy. One biscuit came out lopsided, another too thin. She laughed. Not cruel, not mocking, just warm. "That one looks like Kansas after the floods," she teased. Gently, he looked at it, tilted his head, and chuckled under his breath. "Still better than the last one." "Progress," she said, eyes gleaming. The oven warmed the room, and soon the scent of baking filled the air, rich, buttery, slightly sweet. It wrapped around them like a memory of home. They sat side by side as the biscuits browned, talking about nothing much. Ellie told him about her mother's old apron, how it had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. Owen told her about his first horse, a stubborn mare named June, who had refused to go anywhere without a carrot. "You still got that apron?" he asked, glancing at her quietly. Ellie looked down. "No, it was one of the things I had to leave behind." He nodded, said nothing more. When the biscuits were ready, she pulled them from the oven and placed them on a cloth to cool. Owen reached for one before it was cool, burning his fingers. "Hot," he muttered, jerking back. "Told you," she said, laughing again. He blew on the biscuit and tried again. This time, he managed to bite. His face changed, not dramatically, but "Enough, it's good," he said, as if surprised. "Of course it is," she said with mock offense. "What do you think I've been feeding you all these weeks?" He chewed a moment longer, then said, "This one's different." Ellie paused. "How so?" "It tastes like something new," he replied. "Not just food, like the start of something." "I don't know." She blushed and looked down at her hands. The next morning, Ellie came into the kitchen expecting the usual firewood, eggs, maybe a small jar of preserves, but something else waited for her, a small bundle wrapped in twine, sitting neatly at the center of the table. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a bunch of wild flowers, clover, sage, 2 early daisies, and something purple she didn't recognize. No note, no name. Owen came in a minute later, his boots heavy on the floor. He didn't say anything at first, just walked to the sink and washed his hands. Then, as he dried them, he nodded toward the flowers. "For the kitchen," he said simply. "It smells like life again." Ellie turned to him, her fingers brushing the petals. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then went back outside. Later that day, she found herself humming while she kneaded dough. The song was something her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. Ellie hadn't thought of it in years, but now it rose to her lips without effort. That evening they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn gold behind the hills. Neither said much, but Ellie noticed how Owen's arm rested just a little closer than before, how he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he exhaled like a man beginning to breathe again. In the fading light, she looked at him. "You ever think about what it means to stay?" she asked quietly. He tilted his head. "Meaning?" She shrugged. "Most people I've met, they run. Run from places, run from themselves, run from what they lost. But this place, it feels like staying might not be the same as being stuck." He looked at her for a long time. "I've been stuck before," he said. This don't feel like that." She smiled, soft and slow. "No, it don't. There were no grand declarations, no promises made under moonlight, just the warmth of two people learning how to belong in their own quiet way." And in that simple silence, surrounded by biscuits and wild flowers, a smile bloomed that neither had worn in years. Spring returned to the plains, gentle and full of color. The wild flowers came first, scattered tufts of purple and yellow across the ridge, and then the grass, green and forgiving after a long wind-bitten winter. The ranch, once so quiet it felt haunted, now hummed with simple rhythm. Fences mended, soil tilled, biscuits rising before sunrise. The kitchen had changed the most. It was no longer just a place to eat. It was alive with conversation, laughter, and smells that made even the coldest mornings feel warm. Ellie Mae stood by the window, her hands still dusted with flour. She watched Owen across the yard, hammering a new beam into the porch rail. His shirt clung to his back, streaked with sweat and sawdust. She smiled faintly, then her smile faded. A letter sat folded on the table behind her. An offer. The mayor's wife from town had come by last week, tasted Ellie's peach cobbler, and said it was better than anything this side of Abilene. She had a storefront open, a small kitchen in need of a baker, a chance to start her own shop, her own name above the door. Ellie had never had that, never had much of anything, and yet she baked one last loaf before dusk, a golden-crusted sourdough. Her mother's recipe. That evening she found Owen on the porch, gazing out over the fields. She sat beside him, placed the loaf between them, and spoke quietly. "I was thinking I might go," she said. "Town's got a kitchen with my name waiting. Stove that works. Real customers." Owen nodded slowly. He looked at the loaf, then at her. "You should," he said, "if that's where your heart's leaning." Ellie swallowed. "It's not about heart. It's about not missing what might be mine. I understand." He stood and stepped off the porch, walking back into the house without another word. She sat there alone for a long time, the bread untouched, the night colder than it had been all week. The next morning, just after sunrise, Owen stood in the barn tying up bundles of rope when he heard footsteps behind him. Ellie's voice came soft but certain. "I made it to the edge of town," she said. He turned. She stood there still in her apron, a warm loaf tucked beneath one arm, a travel sack nowhere to be seen. "But when I saw the sun hit that ridge, I just couldn't go." Owen took a step toward her, eyes searching. "I'm not leaving," she continued, holding out the loaf. "Not unless you fire me." Owen looked at her for a moment. Neither of them moved. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out something small wrapped in an old cloth worn thin from years of being kept close. He unfolded it. A silver ring, modest, scuffed with age, but clean, whole. He placed it in her flower-streaked hand. "Then you're not just hired," he said, voice low and rough. "You're home." Ellie blinked quickly, her fingers closed around the ring. "I hope you like biscuits every day," she whispered. He smiled. "As long as they come with you." The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the ranch house, the old fence, the kitchen window with its patched curtains. Birds chirped in the distance. Somewhere a windmill creaked. Inside the kitchen, the fire crackled. 2 mugs of coffee waited, and on the table beside them, a single wild flower in a mason jar. It wasn't a grand proposal. There were no candles, no music, no lace, but it was love as sure as anything ever was. Love in the shape of a warm loaf, a silver ring, a place by the fire, and a man who didn't say much, but who had said enough. Because sometimes home is the only vow you need. If this story stirred something in your heart, the silence of a man's love, the strength of a woman's will, the warmth of a home built from nothing but kindness, then there are more tales waiting for you on this journey through the old American frontier. Subscribe to Heart of the West Love Stories for more timeless romances born from dust, wind, and quiet devotion. Stories where words are few, but hearts speak volumes. Where love isn't just felt, it's earned. Because out here in the West, even the loneliest souls can find their way home, one firelit night at a time.